He paid for every flower, every chair, every drop of champagne, yet his son's wedding shoved him into the kitchen, beside grease-stained trays and squeaking carts like a servant, not a father. He forced a smile, swallowed his fury, and let the humiliation burn, while music and laughter roared just beyond the swinging door. No speech, no recognition, not even a glance. He was erased from the story he had funded. But when the last slice of cake was gone, he reached for his phone. 3 words, 3 calls, and the celebration they thought was theirs began to crumble. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now and tell us where you're watching from. The folding chair creaked under his weight as he lowered himself onto it, its metal legs uneven on the tile floor, wobbling with every shift of his body. This was not the place of honor a father should expect at his only son's wedding. It was the forgotten corner of a bustling kitchen, where steam rose from boiling pots, trays of shrimp cocktails clattered onto carts with one broken wheel that squealed in protest, and the sour tang of marinara sauce hung heavy in the air. He had imagined being seated at the head table, his name written in elegant script on a polished card, his son raising a glass to thank him for a lifetime of sacrifice. Instead, his chair bore no name, no place card, only a paper napkin tossed carelessly across the seat, as though he were an afterthought. Humiliation pressed down on him like the heat from the ovens at his back, and he stared straight ahead, unwilling to let the room of strangers see how his chest ached. Around him, laughter and music swelled, muffled by the swinging door that opened and shut with bursts of gold light and echoes of joy. Each time it moved, he caught glimpses of chandeliers glittering above the reception hall, of his son grinning in a tailored suit, of the bride's family raising their glasses as though they had raised him too. The irony stung like salt in a fresh wound. It was he who had worked overtime shifts, who had patched broken shoes with careful hands, who had gone without so his boy could have braces, uniforms, and dignity. He had built this day from the ground up with money he did not have to spare. Yet here he was, banished to the margins, a servant at best, an invisible man at worst. He smoothed the front of his suit, the same one he had worn to job interviews years earlier when the stakes were survival, not appearances. It felt too tight now. His shoulders cramped beneath the weight of it, the fabric dampened by the heat of the kitchen. He had spent 3 hours that morning sitting still while a barber trimmed the gray at his temples, while his shoes were polished until they gleamed like mirrors. He wanted to look the part of a proud father, wanted to show his son that no matter how hard the years had been, he could still stand tall on the most important day of his boy's life. Now, sitting in the kitchen shadows, the suit felt more like a costume in a cruel play. He reached for the small leather bag he had brought with him, the one his son had given him for Father's Day years ago, when gifts still came from love rather than obligation. He ran his fingers across the worn handles, the leather soft from age, and for a moment he let himself remember the boy who had once wrapped his arms around him and whispered, "You're the best dad." That memory cut deeper than the exclusion of tonight, because it proved how far they had drifted, how easily gratitude had withered into entitlement. A young catering manager passed by, barely 20, carrying a clipboard he clutched like a shield. He hesitated when his eyes landed on the father, embarrassment flickering across his face. Sir, they said you were supposed to wait back here." The bride didn't want any visual clashes with the theme. The words fell with a dull thud, each syllable hammering in the father's ears. Visual clashes. Theme. As though he were a stain to be scrubbed away from the picture-perfect vision of a wedding he had bankrolled. He nodded once, silent, his jaw tight enough to ache, The boy shifted uncomfortably and hurried off, leaving the father alone again with the clatter of dishes and the smell of grease. He pulled the wedding program from his jacket pocket, unfolding the cream cardstock with careful fingers. The letters swirled in elegant cursive, announcing names that were not his, speeches that would not include him. The bride's father would walk her down the aisle. The bride's mother would speak first. The father of the groom was nowhere on the page, as though he had ceased to exist in the story of his own child's life. He traced the ink with his thumb, feeling its smooth surface and wondering how it was possible for something so beautiful to carry such cruelty. A burst of applause erupted from the other room, followed by the opening chords of the first dance. He shifted in his seat, the chair groaning beneath him, and leaned just enough to catch a glimpse through the crack of the door. There was his son, twirling his bride beneath the chandelier's glow, her gown glittering like frost. The crowd roared with approval, glasses clinking, feet tapping against the floor in rhythm. His son never glanced his way, not once. The father pressed his napkin to his lips, pretending to dab away a stain that wasn't there, masking the sting of tears that threatened to break free. He told himself it was the steam, the onions frying in the pan nearby, not the betrayal. But the truth clawed at him, raw and undeniable. A waiter brushed past him, balancing a tray of crab puffs, and gave him a fleeting smile, polite and apologetic. It made no difference. He was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a day he had paid to create. He looked down at the plate set in front of him, a slab of chicken breast already going cold, sauce congealing into a sticky film. He could not bring himself to eat. Hunger twisted in his stomach, but it was not for food. It was for respect, for acknowledgement, for the smallest sign that his devotion had meant something. The bride's laughter carried through the door, light and sharp, cutting him deeper than any blade. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the wall, the plaster cool against his skin. Somewhere deep inside, a fracture spread across his chest, quiet but certain, like a crack in glass that would soon shatter. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself, forcing composure into his posture. He had spent a lifetime swallowing pride, biting back words, choosing silence for the sake of peace. Tonight, silence felt different. It was no longer submission. It was the coil of a spring wound tight, waiting for release. When dessert arrived, a slice of cake layered in gold and white, he stared at it without touching the fork. The sweetness mocked him, the intricate design a testament to the indulgence he had funded. He thought of all the bills stacked on his kitchen counter, the long nights of labor that had built the foundation of this day, and rage simmered quietly beneath the surface of his calm exterior. He knew then that this chair, this exile, was not the end of the story. The music swelled again, voices rising in a chorus of cheer. But he remained still, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. His humiliation had ripened into clarity. They believed they had sidelined him, erased him, reduced him to nothing. They had forgotten that the power of this wedding did not lie in flowers or gowns or chandeliers. It lay in the man who had made it all possible. As the last notes of a song drifted through the door, he reached for his phone, sliding it from his pocket with deliberate calm. His reflection glimmered faintly in the black screen, the lines of his face harder now, sharper, carved by years of sacrifice and tonight's betrayal. He pressed the button, and the screen came alive. His thumb hovered over the first number, steady, sure. The night was not yet over. What came next would turn the celebration on its head. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him that was not grief, not shame, not humiliation. It was power. And once he claimed it, nothing would ever be the same. The cream-colored program trembled slightly in his hand, though not from age or weakness, but from something far sharper, a bitterness that lodged itself deep in his chest. He had unfolded the elegant cardstock slowly, almost reverently, as if the careful curves of the cursive letters might finally give him the recognition he deserved. Instead, the names were hers, the speeches were theirs, and his role was nowhere to be found. His son's new family filled the page, their moments of honor printed for all to see, while he, the man who had carried the weight of this entire day on his back, was not even a footnote. It was as if the years of sacrifice, the decades of working shifts until his hands cracked, the quiet giving without ever asking in return, had been erased in a single stroke of ink. He folded the program again, the edges crisp and final, like a door shutting in his face. The sounds of the reception swelled through the swinging door behind him, each burst of laughter a reminder of what he had been excluded from. He sat there, shoulders squared, a man trying to hold on to the last threads of dignity, while the world on the other side of the wall carried on without him. The clinking of glasses rang like mockery. The applause echoed like a verdict. His son had chosen his place, not beside him, not even near him, but behind a door, with the servers and the stains on the floor. The thought pressed down harder than the heat rolling off the ovens. He had not expected glory, not even a spotlight, but he had expected acknowledgement, a single word of gratitude, a nod, a moment. But there was nothing, only silence where his name should have been spoken, where his presence should have been honored. He thought back to the years when his son was young, when every milestone had been a fight to make possible. He remembered scraping together money for a Little League uniform, remembered working overtime for braces his son wore with pride, remembered sewing buttons back onto school clothes long after midnight so his boy would never feel lesser. Those memories pressed against him now with cruel force, because they were the very foundation of this day, the bricks that had built the man standing at the altar. And yet, in the eyes of the bride's family, in the eyes of the polished guests laughing beneath chandeliers, he was nothing but a shadow, invisible, disposable. The weight of it made his jaw tighten, his teeth grinding against the silence he had chosen. He wanted to stand, to walk through that door, to demand the recognition that was rightfully his. But he stayed seated, not out of weakness, but out of calculation. He understood the cost of exploding too soon. He had built his life on patience, on the discipline of waiting for the right moment, the moment when silence turns to power. Tonight would be no different. For now he sat and endured the sting of erasure, but in the marrow of his bones something darker and steadier began to form. Through the crack of the door, he caught sight of his son again, laughing with the bride's parents, leaning toward them as though he had been theirs all along. The sight struck harder than any insult. That laugh used to belong to him, born in backyards during summers of sprinklers and fireflies, during evenings when they would sit together on worn porch steps and share jokes only the two of them understood. Now that laugh was offered freely to strangers, to people who had not carried the burden, who had not bled and bent to see him smile. He clenched the program tighter, its edges cutting faint lines into his palm. The speeches began, each voice rising over the crowd, each word digging deeper into the void where his own acknowledgement should have been. The bride's father boomed with pride, painting himself as a pillar in his daughter's story, his tone claiming ownership over a day the father had made possible. The bride's mother spoke next, syrupy and rehearsed, thanking everyone except the one who had paid the bill. He listened, the words striking his ears like stones, each omission a wound. Then came his son, standing tall, glowing with the kind of confidence that had been built on the quiet sacrifices of another man's back. His voice carried clearly, thanking the bride, thanking her family, thanking the guests, thanking everyone, but the man sitting in the shadows of a kitchen. It was more than omission. It was annihilation. His son did not forget him. No, forgetting was accidental, a slip of the mind. This was deliberate. This was a choice to erase him, to rewrite the narrative of who mattered and who had made the day possible. His name, his presence, his history had been scrubbed from the story, and in its place stood a polished lie. He felt it then, the strange heaviness of nothing, the kind of numbness that comes after too much pain, when the body and mind can no longer bear the weight and retreat into silence. It wasn't grief anymore. It was clarity. His fingers loosened on the program, letting it fall to the table, the thick cardstock landing with a hollow thump. He stared at his hands, rough from years of labor, veins raised beneath skin that carried every scar of his sacrifices. These hands had held his son when he was fragile, had steadied him when he was learning to walk, had written checks when the boy's future was on the line. And now those same hands were being ignored, dismissed, rendered invisible. He flexed his fingers slowly, as though rediscovering them, as though realizing they still carried power. The music picked up again, laughter spilling through the door, joy filling the hall. But for him, the sound became nothing more than static, a dull hum in the background of a sharper realization. They thought they had written him out of the script, but they had overlooked the truth. He wasn't gone. He wasn't powerless. He was still here, still holding the strings, still in control of more than they could imagine. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning beneath his weight, and let the numbness settle into something harder. His humiliation had turned to stone, solid and unmovable. His silence had become strategy. He had spent a lifetime giving until there was nothing left for himself, and now that giving had been twisted into a weapon against him. But he would not remain invisible, not for long. The program lay on the table, its words as empty as the promises that had led him here. He did not pick it up again. He no longer needed to see the proof of his erasure. He had felt it. He had lived it, and he knew with every beat of his heart that the time for silence was running out. Soon, they would know what it meant to push him aside. Soon, they would learn that a man erased can still write himself back into the story. What came next would not be quiet. It would not be kind. It would be unforgettable. He sat in the shadowed corner, the program abandoned on the table beside him, and his eyes unfocused against the swirl of steam and clatter of trays. Beyond the kitchen door, music and applause erupted like waves breaking against stone, each burst of laughter cutting through the thin wall as though mocking his silence. His son's voice carried faintly, warm and confident, directed toward the people who now claimed him. And with that sound came a flood of memories he had never asked for. They rose unbidden, sharp and merciless, dragging him back through the years of sacrifice that had shaped this day. He saw himself bent over workbenches in the dead of night, grease on his hands, sweat soaking through his shirt, punching the clock for another overtime shift that would mean new shoes or tuition payments. He remembered carrying 2 jobs at once, his body breaking but his resolve steady, because every dollar meant his son could have a life untouched by the kind of hunger and humiliation he had endured. Those nights had been endless, the kind where his bones felt hollow and his eyes stung from exhaustion. But he endured them willingly, fueled by the image of his boy smiling without worry. And now, through the crack in the swinging door, that same smile was aimed at strangers draped in pearls and polished suits, strangers who raised their glasses as though they had earned it. The bitterness tasted metallic on his tongue, as if every sacrifice had curdled into something poisonous in his chest. He thought of the first time his son had come home in tears, bullied for the gap in his teeth. He had worked double shifts at the factory, swallowing pain in his knees until the braces were paid for, just so that smile could shine. He thought of Christmas mornings when he had pawned his own tools to put gifts under the tree, his son ripping through wrapping paper with joy, never knowing the cost. He thought of the nights he skipped dinner so there would be enough food left on the table, telling the boy he wasn't hungry when in truth his stomach growled loud enough to keep him awake. Each memory was a stone, and together they weighed heavy in his chest, pressing until it was hard to breathe. All those years he had carried the burden, shaping his son's life with invisible hands. And tonight those hands were ignored, dismissed, forgotten. He stared down at his own fingers now, scarred and veined, hands that had once carried his son across puddles, hands that had patched torn jackets, hands that had signed check after check until his account bled dry. They had built everything, brick by brick, moment by moment, and now they lay still against his knees, invisible to the very boy whose world they had built. Through the narrow gap in the door, he saw his son lean into the bride's mother, listening with a grin that once belonged only to him. That grin, born from years of scraped knees kissed better, from laughter echoing across summer evenings with fireflies, from bedtime stories whispered to chase away the dark. It was his legacy, his reward, his reason for living. And now it was being handed over to strangers who had known nothing of the years of sacrifice. The sadness came not as tears, but as a hollow ache, an emptiness that spread like smoke in his chest. He had prepared himself for this day with hope, not for glory, not even for thanks, but for recognition. To be seen, to be remembered as the man who made it possible. Instead, he was watching a performance where his part had been written out, his presence reduced to a checkbook and a shadow. His son twirled his bride beneath the chandelier, golden light shimmering across faces that cheered, and the father's gaze lingered on the boy's smile, so radiant, so unburdened, as if it had been given to him by someone else entirely. That smile should have carried his reflection. Instead, it belonged to strangers. His jaw tightened, the muscles twitching with every swallow of silence. Resentment laced itself around his sadness, a creeping vine that tightened with each laugh that rose from the hall. He thought of the nights when his back ached so badly he could barely stand. But still he rose before dawn to pack lunches and see his boy off to school. He thought of the time he had sold his wedding band, the last trace of the woman he had loved, so his son could have a prom suit that fit just right. He thought of watching from the bleachers, working on no sleep, just to clap for a boy who never once glanced up to see him there. And tonight, that same boy stood beneath chandeliers, beaming at people who had offered nothing but open arms at the finish line. The injustice of it pulsed behind his eyes, hot and relentless, as though his very blood had turned to fire. He gripped the edge of the table, the metal biting into his palm, and forced his breath into even, measured draws. He would not break here, not in this kitchen where humiliation pressed against him like the heat of the ovens. No, he would endure it as he had endured everything else, in silence, waiting, watching, calculating. Because beneath the weight of resentment and the ache of sadness, another emotion stirred, something colder, something steadier. He had been invisible before and survived. He had been erased and still endured. And now, as he watched the boy he had raised laugh with strangers as though they had carried him through the storms, he felt the fracture inside him widen into resolve. He leaned back slightly, his chair groaning, and let his eyes trace the crack of the door one more time. His son did not look for him. His son did not even hesitate. And in that certainty, the father found clarity. The sacrifices he had made were real, etched into every scar, every ache, every sleepless night. But the gratitude he had expected, the acknowledgement he had hoped for, was gone, erased. And if his son would not honor him, then he would honor himself. He would not remain in the kitchen, not in spirit, not in story. The music shifted again, louder now, the tempo quickening as the dance floor filled. He set the program aside, his hand no longer trembling. The numbness that had once dulled the pain was gone, replaced by something sharper, honed like a blade drawn across stone. His sacrifices had built this day, but his silence would not define it. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the swell of celebration on the other side of the door, and when he opened them again, there was no sadness left, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. The time for sacrifice had passed. The time for silence was ending. What waited on the other side of that decision was not yet clear, but it would not be gentle, and it would not be forgettable. It would be his. And when it came, they would remember the man they had tried so hard to erase. Through the narrow crack of the kitchen door, the father leaned just enough to catch a sliver of the reception hall. Crystal chandeliers poured gold light over the tables. Laughter rolled in waves across the room. And at the center of it all, his son twirled his bride as if the entire world belonged to them. He had expected that, the spotlight, the applause. What he had not expected was the moment when her eyes found his, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the crowd with surgical precision. For an instant, the noise of the room dulled, the music flattened, and there was only her gaze fixed on him. She knew exactly where he had been seated, exactly how far they had pushed him from the picture, and then she smiled, not nervous, not apologetic, but calm, dismissive, confident. It was the smile of someone who believed she had won, someone who had orchestrated his erasure and savored the victory. Something shifted in him, subtle at first, then consuming. The ache in his chest, the grief of being forgotten, hollowed out in an instant, leaving room for something colder, steadier. Rage slid into its place, not the kind that explodes in shouts or fists, but the kind that hardens a man's spine and steadies his breath. It was the rage of awakening, the sudden clarity that what had been done to him was not an accident, not an oversight, but a choice. They had placed him here deliberately, exiled from the celebration he had built, and worse, they had dared to smile about it. He pulled back from the door, his pulse steady, his jaw clenched tight enough to grind bone. The kitchen hummed with noise, trays clattering, steam hissing, but it all faded beneath the silence that grew inside him. He no longer heard the laughter or the speeches, no longer cared about the flowers or the glittering lights. His world narrowed to a single truth. He had been pushed aside, and they believed he would stay there. They believed his silence was weakness. They believed they had broken him, but they were wrong. He sat again, his chair squealing against the tile, and folded his hands together, studying them as if seeing them for the first time. These were the same hands that had built a life from scraps, that had carried his son when he was small, that had held every sacrifice quietly. Tonight, they trembled no longer. They were steady, firm, and ready. The grief that had pressed down on his shoulders all evening evaporated, leaving in its wake a quiet fire that would not be extinguished. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Not in the way joy makes a man feel alive, but in the way fury sharpens the senses and strips away illusion. He thought again of her smile, the way her lips curved with certainty, as though she believed she had written him out of the script entirely. The arrogance of it stoked his resolve. He understood then that humiliation was no longer his burden to carry. It was theirs, waiting just beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment he chose to turn this silence into action. He would not confront them now, not with words, not with shouts across the reception hall. No, he would let the night continue, Let them revel in their false victory. Let them drink and laugh and dance while the ground beneath them quietly shifted. The music rose again. A fast song now, glasses clinking as guests shouted in delight. He remained still, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes closed as he listened to the pulse of it through the plaster. The beat thudded like a heartbeat, and for every note that passed, his decision solidified. He was not broken. He was not defeated. He was waiting. And when the moment came, when his silence cracked open, it would not be sorrow that poured out. It would be power. He rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, the motion drawing no attention from the staff bustling around him. He smoothed his jacket, squared his shoulders, and glanced once more at the door. Beyond it, his son laughed again, the sound bright and oblivious, carrying across the hall as if the man in the kitchen no longer existed. The father's lips curled, not in joy, but in something closer to resolve. They thought him invisible. They thought him erased. But in truth, they had given him the perfect vantage point, the perfect silence from which to strike. He stepped back, pulling his phone from his pocket, the glow of the screen lighting the sharp lines of his face. His thumb hovered above the contacts, steady, certain. The rage in him did not shake his hands, it sharpened them. The grief that had once blurred his vision cleared, leaving nothing but precision. One call, he thought. That was all it would take to unravel the perfect picture they had painted, to remind them that the man they had cast aside still held the power to redraw the scene. He slipped the phone back into his jacket for now, letting the thought simmer like coals beneath ash. Timing mattered. Patience mattered. They had taught him that by forcing him to endure this night in silence, by showing him the cruelty of exclusion dressed up as decorum, now he would use that silence against them, transform it into a weapon sharper than any outburst could ever be. The door swung open again, another burst of music spilling into the kitchen, another flash of light catching his son's grin. The bride's hand rested on his arm, her head tilted back in laughter, and for an instant her eyes flicked again to the kitchen. Perhaps she expected to find him crumbling, head bowed, spirit broken. Instead, she found him standing tall, shoulders squared, eyes fixed back on her with a steadiness she had not anticipated. He saw the flicker of hesitation cross her face, small but telling, before she turned back toward her guests. He allowed himself the faintest smirk. She had drawn the battle line with her smile. Now she would see what it meant to face him on the other side of it. He sat again, this time not as a man defeated, but as a man coiled, ready. The noise of the hall blurred into nothing. The smell of grease and garlic became background, the clatter of trays a rhythm he barely noticed. Inside, all that remained was focus. Grief was gone. Sadness was gone. Only rage remained, honed and waiting, and when the moment came, when the last slice of cake was gone and the night tipped into silence, he would no longer be the forgotten man in the kitchen. He would be the storm they never saw coming. The phone was cool and heavy in his hand, its screen glowing faintly against the dim light of the kitchen. He stared at it for a moment, listening to the muffled laughter bleeding through the swinging door, the clink of champagne glasses rising in another round of toasts, the careless joy of a celebration built on his back. His son's voice echoed faintly, smooth and confident, thanking everyone except the man who had paid for the air they were breathing. He took a slow breath, steady and measured, then pressed the first number. His voice, when it came, was calm, polite, stripped of any trace of weakness. He told the florist that Sunday's delivery would not be needed, the order canceled, the balance withheld. The woman on the other end stammered in confusion, but he did not waver. "Thank you," he said simply, and ended the call. His thumb moved immediately to the next contact. The band's manager answered quickly, cheerful and unsuspecting, his words tumbling over each other about how well the first set had gone. The father's voice cut through with precision, flat and controlled. "Due to changes in the schedule," he said, "the second performance would not be required. Consider the matter closed." There was a pause, a hint of protest, but he had already ended the call before it could form into words. He did not owe explanations. Not anymore. The third number came easily, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of decades spent balancing books, paying bills, keeping accounts alive long enough to raise a boy who now erased him. The bar manager picked up, the clamor of glasses and voices behind him. The father's tone remained steady, polite, but final. The late shift, the custom cocktail menu, the open bar until midnight. It was all canceled. Do not process the remaining balance. Thank you. He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his jacket, and sat in silence. For the first time in years, his hands were still. No tremor, no shake, just a quiet hum of energy running beneath his skin like an engine settling into perfect rhythm. He looked down at them. These hands that had carried his son's childhood. These hands that had bent beneath labor and sacrifice. These hands that had been ignored and dismissed. Tonight, they were steady again. Tonight, they belonged to him. The weight that had pressed against his chest all evening began to lift, replaced not by joy, not even by relief, but by something sharper. Control. Through the door, the music swelled into another chorus, the band playing as though the night would last forever. He leaned back in his chair, listening, knowing that soon the notes would cut short, the bar would run dry, the flowers would fail to arrive. He pictured the confusion spreading like a crack across glass, the whispers at the tables, the sideways glances, the dawning realization that the man they had erased still held the power to pull the strings. He imagined his son searching the crowd for answers, the bride's family frowning, their perfect vision unraveling thread by thread. The thought brought no smile to his face, only a stillness, a deep satisfaction that hummed in his bones. They had thought him invisible. They had thought him powerless. But it was his hand on the switch, his voice that ended the music, his choice that dried the glasses. He rose from the chair, the old metal legs scraping against the tile, and walked to the mirror above the catering counter. His reflection startled him. The sag of exhaustion was gone, the slump of grief replaced by lines carved sharp with purpose. His eyes, once dulled by humiliation, gleamed with something fierce, something unshakable. He adjusted his tie, smoothed the lapels of his jacket, and stood taller than he had all night. The noise from the hall no longer reached him the same way. It was distant, hollow, as though the wall had thickened between them. He was no longer begging for a place at their table. He was building his own. He paced the narrow length of the kitchen, each step measured, deliberate. The waitstaff scurried around him, glancing nervously, but saying nothing. Perhaps they saw it in his face, the gravity of a man who had shifted from victim to force. He did not need to shout. His silence carried weight enough to bend the air. Every breath he took seemed to steady the storm within him, a storm now under his command. He had felt powerless for so long, crushed by his son's dismissal, erased by strangers who wore his sacrifices like borrowed finery. But no longer. Power thrummed in him, quiet and sure, and for the first time in decades, he felt whole. He sat again, the program still lying where he had dropped it, the names of others etched in neat cursive across its surface. He did not pick it up. He did not need to. They could write his name out of their story, but he had just rewritten theirs. His absence would not be quiet anymore. It would echo across the hall, reverberating with every silence where music should have been, with every empty glass where champagne should have flowed, with every table missing the flowers they had expected. His erasure would be replaced by their embarrassment, his invisibility by their downfall. The minutes stretched, each one bringing him closer to the unraveling. He imagined it, felt it, savored it like the first deep breath after drowning. For years, he had lived in service to others, bending, giving, sacrificing, until he was hollow. Tonight, for the first time, he had taken something back. Not for them, not for recognition, but for himself. The stillness in his hands, the steadiness in his chest, the clarity in his mind, all of it told him he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer the man exiled to the kitchen. He was the man who chose the moment to remind them who he was. The music hit its peak, the cheer of the crowd swelling, and then, like a candle snuffed out, it would falter. The bar would dry. The whispers would start. The cracks would spread. He sat in that chair, calm and patient, listening to the sound of their borrowed joy, knowing it would not last. And when the silence came, when the weight of absence settled over them, they would remember him. They would have no choice. For the first time in years, he was not trembling. He was steady. He was in control. And what came next would belong entirely to him. The air outside was cooler than he expected, sharp against his skin after hours trapped in the stifling heat of the kitchen. He stepped into the night with measured strides, leaving behind the pulsing music and hollow laughter that had mocked him all evening. The hotel lights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching his figure into something darker, larger, a man remade by his own silence. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, the celebration still roared, oblivious to the threads already unraveling beneath their polished illusion. His calls had set the fuse, and though the night still glittered with chandeliers and champagne, morning would bring nothing but chaos. He walked without destination, his shoes clicking softly against the concrete, the cool hum of the city at night filling the spaces where humiliation had once lived. The rage that had burned through him was no longer fire, but steel, cooled and sharpened, leaving only clarity. For the first time in years, his chest was free of the weight that had bent him. Every breath he took felt deliberate, every step a declaration. They had believed him powerless. They had smiled as they erased him. Now they would choke on the silence he had chosen, a silence that would bloom into absence, into failure, into shame. By the time he reached his car, the phone in his pocket buzzed. He didn't check it. He already knew the names that would be flashing across the screen. His son, the bride, the frantic new family that had claimed him. They would be searching for him, demanding explanations, scrambling to patch holes that could no longer be mended. He slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and let the quiet wrap around him like armor. He turned the key, the engine rumbling steady beneath his hands, and drove into the night with no destination but away. Away from their laughter, their dismissal, their smug certainty. The satisfaction that filled him was not loud or wild. It was quiet, deep, and steady. The kind of vindication that doesn't shout but whispers, "Now you know." Morning came quickly, light bleeding across the sky in shades of bruised purple and pale gold. He had not slept, not wanted to. Instead, he sat in the stiff chair of his hotel room, still in his suit, staring at the ceiling fan that spun endlessly above him. The phone buzzed again and again, vibrating across the nightstand until it fell to the carpet. But he left it there. By the time he finally picked it up, the screen was littered with missed calls, messages stacking one on top of the other like frantic footsteps in a burning building. He opened none of them. Instead, He scrolled calmly through the notes he had made, double-checking each cancellation. The florist, the band, the bar. Every call had been polite, professional, final. The weight of control sat steady in his chest, and with each confirmation, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally reminded them that he mattered. Downstairs, guests stirred, their laughter now softened by the hangover of indulgence. By noon, confusion rippled across the venue. Servers scrambled, vendors whispered. The bride's mother raised her voice in disbelief. Where were the flowers for the brunch? Why had the band packed their instruments and left? Why were guests standing around dry bars, their hands empty of champagne flutes? The carefully constructed vision of perfection collapsed in slow motion, and at its center stood silence. The silence of the man they had pushed aside. He imagined it, savored it, the sudden tightening of his son's jaw, the furrow of confusion between his brows as realization set in. His bride's smile faltering, her perfect day cracking at the edges. The whispers spreading among the guests. What happened? Who was responsible? How could something so lavish fall apart so quickly? He sat by the window of his room, coffee cooling in his hands, and let himself picture every detail. The bride's family, furious, embarrassed, scrambling to salvage what they could. His son, caught between loyalty and shame, finally forced to confront the truth of who had built this day. The image filled him with a sense of vindication deeper than any speech or toast could have offered. They had erased him, yes, but they could not erase his absence. And now his absence was louder than their applause. When his phone rang again, he finally answered, pressing it to his ear with a calmness that unnerved the voice on the other end. "Dad," his son's voice cracked with desperation. "What happened? The flowers, the band, the bar, they're gone. People are asking questions. You have to fix this." The father said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then evenly he replied, "You erased me. Now you can live with what that feels like." He ended the call before his son could respond, set the phone back on the table, and leaned into his chair. The satisfaction was not in the chaos itself, but in the shift of power. The reminder that he was no longer the man banished to a folding chair. The hours passed, and with them came more messages, more apologies, more accusations dressed as pleas. He read none of them. He had no need. The storm he had unleashed would rage without his hand, each wave of confusion and shame a tribute to the man they had underestimated. As evening fell, he walked again into the night, the cool air brushing against his face, the city alive with its own rhythm. He was no longer part of their story, and that truth, once bitter, now tasted clean. Vindication was not the roar of triumph, but the steady hum of peace in his chest. For years, he had been defined by sacrifice, by silence, by giving until nothing remained. Tonight, he was defined by something else. Control, power reclaimed, satisfaction earned not through their gratitude, but through their failure. He had walked away from the reception into darkness. But in that darkness, he found himself again. And as he moved through the quiet streets, his footsteps unhurried, his back unbowed, he knew one thing with certainty. They would never forget what he had done. They would never again mistake his silence for weakness. What came next would be his choosing, and for the first time in years, the story belonged to him. The house was quiet when he returned, the kind of silence that hummed in the walls and pressed down like a weight. He set his jacket over the back of a chair, loosened his tie, and let his eyes linger on the familiar lines of the living room, the worn armchair by the window, the stack of unopened mail on the table, the framed photos of birthdays and graduations lining the mantel. Every picture was proof of the life he had built, the sacrifices he had made, the love he had poured into his son. Yet tonight, standing in that room, those images looked different, distant, almost mocking. The laughter frozen in glossy prints felt like it belonged to someone else's family, someone else's story. He lowered himself onto the couch, the springs groaning beneath him, and rubbed his temples. He wanted to rest, to let the exhaustion wash over him. But something in the air tugged at him, restless and insistent. He rose and walked to the bedroom, pulling open the dresser drawer that stuck halfway every time. He shoved it with his hip, the wood creaking as it gave way, and reached inside for the red folder buried beneath old bills and tax returns. He hadn't thought about it in years. It was a remnant of another life, tucked away because he couldn't bear to look at it then. Now, as his fingers brushed against its worn edges, he felt a strange urgency, as though it had been waiting for this night. He pulled it out, sat on the edge of the bed, and flipped it open. At the bottom of a stack of brittle papers lay a single envelope, yellowed at the corners, his late wife's handwriting slanting across the front. His breath caught. He remembered the day he had found it, weeks after she had passed, when grief was too raw to let in any more truths. He had hidden it then, terrified of what it might say. But tonight, after being erased from his son's life, after canceling the very celebration he had paid for, he was ready to face whatever truth had been waiting in the dark. His hands shook only once as he slid a finger beneath the flap and unfolded the thin paper. Her handwriting stretched across the page, familiar and painful, each letter pulling him back to nights of whispered promises and arguments softened by laughter. "Margaret," it began, "I know you never wanted to hear from me this way, but there's something I cannot carry with me to the grave. You deserve the truth." He swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the next lines, each word landing like a stone in his chest. "Daniel isn't yours. I was already pregnant when we met. I thought it wouldn't matter, that love could erase the past. But I never told you, and now I can't keep it hidden anymore." The paper slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the bedspread. The room tilted for a moment, the edges of the world blurring as if he were caught in a current pulling him under. His son, his boy, his reason for every sacrifice, was not his flesh, not his blood. Decades of labor, of hunger swallowed so the boy could eat, of nights bent over work so the boy could smile without shame, all of it had been given to a child who was never his. The silence in the room thickened, pressing against his ears, his chest, his very bones. Shock rippled through him, sharp at first, then dull, spreading until he felt nothing at all. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands again. The same hands that had carried Daniel across parking lots, patched his torn sneakers, taught him to hold a baseball bat. Those memories surged like film reels, each one a testament to love that had not cared about blood or truth. He had been there for every scraped knee, every late-night fever, every heartbreak. He had been father, teacher, provider, protector. And now, in the quiet of his bedroom, that love was thrown back at him, dismissed, erased, first by a bride's cruel smile, now by a letter from the woman he had once trusted. His chest felt hollow, as though the truth had scooped everything out of him and left only an echo. But inside that emptiness, clarity began to form. He realized that biology had never raised his son. A name on a birth certificate had never bought braces, or kept the lights on, or paid for college. It had been him, his sweat, his labor, his sacrifices, that built Daniel's life. Blood had nothing to do with it. Yet still, the betrayal burned, not because the boy wasn't his by birth, but because the boy, knowing none of this, had chosen to discard him as though he were nothing. He stood and crossed the room to the window, pulling back the curtain. The night outside was still. the garden bathed in silver moonlight. He remembered planting those roses years ago, his son tugging at his sleeve, asking why flowers mattered when they couldn't be eaten. He had laughed then, said beauty mattered too, even if it cost a little extra. Now those roses bloomed wild and red, their roots deep in soil he had tended, their blossoms uncaring of who claimed them. They were his, just as the life he had built had been his, no matter what the truth on the paper said. He turned back to the letter, lying crumpled on the bed. He picked it up, smoothed it against his thigh, and read the last lines again. I thought I was sparing you, but I realize now I stole your choice. I hope you can forgive me. He stared at the words, but forgiveness was not what filled him. What filled him was a strange calm, a quiet certainty that he would never again allow others to define him by what they withheld or erased. He had raised a son who had chosen to forget him. He had loved a woman who had chosen to lie to him, and yet, through all of it, he had survived. The numbness settled deeper, wrapping around him not as weakness, but as armor. He folded the letter, placed it back in the folder, and returned it to the drawer. The truth had landed, sharp and devastating, but it had also freed him. He no longer needed to chase acknowledgement from a son who would never see him, nor apologies from a wife who could not give them. He had given decades of love to a child who now rejected him, and that fact no longer shattered him. It defined him. It proved his strength. He poured himself a cup of coffee in the kitchen, black and bitter, and sat by the window. The first hints of dawn stretched across the horizon, pale and soft, brushing the edges of the world with light. He sipped slowly, the warmth seeping into him, grounding him. For the first time in years, he did not feel the tremor of need for someone else's approval. He felt only the stillness of clarity. The phone buzzed again on the table, another message from his son. He did not reach for it. He no longer needed to. The truth had rewritten everything. He had been erased at the wedding, dismissed as nothing more than a wallet and an afterthought. But here, in the quiet of his home, he saw the reality with piercing clarity. He had given everything, and it had never depended on blood. That was his legacy, even if no one else remembered it. The sky grew lighter, streaks of orange bleeding into the blue, and he leaned back in his chair, coffee warming his hands. He did not smile, not yet, but the weight on his chest was gone. The truth had gutted him, yes, but it had also carved space for something new. The grief was finished. The humiliation was finished. What remained was resolve. And somewhere deep inside, where rage and sorrow had once fought for control, a new certainty took root. They had erased him from their story, but he would write his own. And this time, no one would ever be able to take it from him. The letter lay folded on the dresser, its truth seared into his bones. But he did not look at it again. He had spent enough years staring at the absence of things, absent honesty, absent gratitude, absent love returned in equal measure. He would not sit in that emptiness any longer. The silence in the house was no longer suffocating. It was a canvas. For the first time in decades, he wondered what it would be like to live for himself, not as someone's provider, not as someone's background, but as a man who still had his own pulse, his own choices. That thought lingered, sharp and liberating, until it grew into something undeniable. He would stop begging for a seat at someone else's table. He would build his own. The decision began quietly, almost like a whisper in the back of his mind. He found himself pulling a notepad from the kitchen drawer, its yellow pages crinkled from age, and uncapped a pen. No glittering invitation stock, no cursive fonts announcing obligation. Just his handwriting, strong and steady, filling the lines. Names came to him not from duty, but from memory. People who had shown him kindness without expectation. Claire, the old friend from the hospital who used to slip him coffee during endless night shifts. Mr. Henderson, the neighbor who cleared his driveway every winter morning before dawn without being asked. Dina from the bookstore, who never forgot to ask how his week had been. People who saw him. People who valued him. As he wrote each name, he felt something stir in his chest. Not grief, not rage, but a warmth he hadn't allowed himself in years. The following days carried a rhythm he had not known since he was young. He walked through the market and chose ingredients that pleased him, not dictated by anyone else's tastes. He filled his basket with heirloom tomatoes, fresh basil, garlic so pungent it stung his nose. He picked out a blue tablecloth threaded with sunflowers, vibrant and alive, the kind of thing he would have once dismissed as frivolous, but now saw as necessary. He cooked in his kitchen with music playing, Van Morrison drifting into Stevie Nicks, soft guitar strings weaving through the air as olive oil hissed in the pan. The house smelled like garlic and lemon zest, not of resentment, not of sacrifice, but of effort made for joy. For his joy. When the evening came, he set the table himself, smoothing the cloth, lighting candles, placing mismatched plates with deliberate care. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, his, a space no one could take from him. As the first knock came, his heart kicked once against his ribs. But it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. He opened the door to Claire's wide smile, a bottle of wine in her hand, and for a moment he felt years peel away, as though he were seeing the world through new eyes. Others followed, each step across his threshold, bringing with it laughter, warmth, and presence. The dinner unfolded not like a ceremony, but like a reunion of souls. They passed plates, poured wine without asking, leaned in close to share stories that burst into laughter. He laughed too, not the hollow, strained chuckle he had worn like armor at the wedding, but the kind that shook his shoulders, the kind that brought tears to his eyes. He watched his table fill with faces illuminated by candlelight, people unbound by obligation, gathered not for what he could give them, but for who he was. It struck him with a force greater than any betrayal had. This was family, not chosen by blood or written in paper programs, but chosen by action, by kindness, by truth. The night deepened, the porch light glowing as they carried their laughter outside, wine glasses glinting under strings of bulbs he had hung earlier. The air was cool but alive, filled with the sound of belonging. Claire raised her glass, her voice steady and certain, and said, "To him, for reminding us, it's never too late to take your place at your own table." The others clinked their glasses, and he felt the weight of their eyes on him, not in judgment, not in expectation, but in recognition. He lifted his own glass, steady now, and the words came easily. "To being seen." He looked around the table, at Mr. Henderson animatedly retelling the story of locking himself out in his underwear, at Dina laughing until tears ran down her cheeks, at Claire smiling at him with quiet pride. His chest swelled with something he hadn't felt in years, joy, raw and unfiltered, the kind that wasn't borrowed from someone else's approval, but born from his own choices. Every scrape of forks, every burst of laughter, every story exchanged across the table was proof that he had not been erased. Not really. He had simply been looking for validation in the wrong place. Later, when the plates were empty and the candles burned low, he leaned back in his chair and let the moment wash over him. The house no longer felt like a museum of sacrifices, but like a place alive again, filled with breath and warmth. He realized then that he did not need the approval of a son who had turned away, nor the validation of in-laws who had smiled as they erased him. He needed this, the sound of his own laughter mingling with others, the sight of his table filled with people who valued him, the knowledge that he was not invisible. When the guests left, Hugs lingering at the door, he stood for a long moment in the quiet of the kitchen, staring at the plates stacked in the sink, the candle stubs melted into puddles of wax. The silence that returned was not empty. It was peaceful. He poured himself the last glass of wine, walked to the porch, and sat beneath the fading glow of the string lights. His garden stretched out before him, roses blooming wild, their petals catching the moonlight. He sipped slowly, feeling the night settle into his bones. He was not erased. He was not forgotten. He was here, alive, present, and finally his own. And as the breeze carried the scent of earth and roses through the night, he thought of what tomorrow might bring. Not sorrow, not anger, something else. Renewal. He had reclaimed himself piece by piece, and now the world would have to see him as he truly was. The man who had built everything, the man who had been dismissed, the man who had been forgotten. He was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone whole, someone who would never again accept a chair in the shadows. The night closed around him, not as exile, but as promise. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the next chapter would not be written by erasure, but by choice. His choice. The knock came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the sun slanted warm through the curtains and the house smelled faintly of coffee and rosemary from the garden. He had been sitting at his table, a book open in front of him, though his eyes had wandered more often to the window than to the page. When the sound echoed again, he rose slowly, unhurried, his steps measured across the wood floor. He already knew who it was before he touched the handle. His son stood on the porch, shoulders tense, face pale, words already pressing at the corners of his mouth. Behind him, the world seemed smaller, stripped of its chandeliers and applause, reduced to a silence that carried more weight than celebration ever could. The father studied him for a long moment, his gaze steady, unflinching. This was the boy he had raised through sleepless nights and back-breaking labor, the boy he had shielded from hunger, clothed with sacrifices stitched into every seam. But the man standing here now was no longer the child he remembered. He was someone who had made choices, cruel ones, deliberate ones, choices that had erased the very hands that had built him. Still, here he was, returned to the door he had once believed could be closed forever. "Dad," the son began, voice uncertain, caught between guilt and entitlement. His eyes flicked past the father into the house, as though searching for welcome, for forgiveness. "We need to talk." The father let the words hang in the air, unmoved. For years he had rushed to fill every silence, to make peace where there was only neglect. But not today. Today, the silence was his, and he wielded it like a blade. At last he spoke, his tone calm, even, but edged with steel. "There's nothing left to say." His son flinched slightly, the weight of those words landing heavier than any shout could have. The father went on, each syllable deliberate. "You erased me. You sat in a room full of strangers and treated me like I wasn't even there. You smiled while they pushed me aside. And now you're here, not because you see me, but because you need something." The son's mouth opened, then closed again, his eyes darting down to the porch boards. "I made a mistake," he muttered, the word small, brittle. His father's gaze did not soften. "A mistake is forgetting a birthday. A mistake is misplacing a bill. What you did was a choice." His voice stayed calm, steady, stripped of anger, stripped of pleading. He had spent too many years begging for acknowledgement. That part of him was gone. The son shifted, hands tightening into fists at his sides. "I'm still your son," he said, desperation creeping into his tone. That word son echoed for a moment between them, heavy with all the nights of sacrifice, all the years of work, all the truths that had been revealed in the silence of his home. The father inhaled slowly, his eyes sharp, his shoulders squared. "Blood or not, you were my son, because I chose you. Every night I worked, every dollar I gave, every bruise I carried. It was choice. Love is choice. Respect is choice. And you gave me none in return." The porch fell silent. Even the wind seemed to still, the roses in the garden holding their breath. His son's face crumpled, the weight of his father's words settling in his chest like stone. For a brief moment, the father felt the old ache stir, the instinct to reach out, to soften, to carry the burden again. But he pressed it down. Mercy, he realized, was not the same as surrender. Forgiveness did not mean erasure of truth. He straightened, one hand on the door, his voice final now. "I will not be your backdrop. I will not be your wallet. I will not be erased in my own life." His son's eyes widened, glistening with something that might have been shame, might have been regret. But the father no longer searched for answers there. He had given decades to questions that never mattered. Now, only one thing mattered. With a slow, deliberate motion, he closed the door. The click of the latch was not violent, not angry. It was quiet, decisive, the sound of a man reclaiming his life. Inside, the house was filled with the soft glow of afternoon light, the hum of his own breathing steady in his chest. He leaned against the door for a moment, not from weakness, but from the release of a weight he had carried too long. He moved back to the table, lifted his coffee and sipped. The bitterness no longer stung. It grounded him. Through the window, he saw his roses swaying again in the breeze, their roots deep, their blossoms defiant. They were his, like this house, like this life he had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. He sat down, opened his book again, and let the words wash over him. Peace was not in the son's return. Peace was in his refusal to bend. Dignity was not in their apologies, but in his own voice, calm and steady, declaring, "Enough." Liberation was not loud, not triumphant, but quiet, steady, like the hum of a man who had finally chosen himself. And as the sun dipped lower, spilling amber light across the floor, he felt something he had not felt in years: freedom. The story was no longer about what had been taken from him. It was about what he had chosen to keep: his dignity, his peace, his life. And that, at last, was enough. Life has a way of teaching us that dignity is not something others give. It's something we must claim for ourselves. This story reminds us that sacrifice, no matter how deep or how long, should never erase our worth. Many seniors know what it feels like to give everything: time, money, health, so children or family can thrive, only to be overlooked in the end. But the truth is clear. Love is not about blood alone. It's about respect, and respect is a choice. When those we've raised or trusted fail to honor us, it doesn't mean our lives lose value. It means we must turn inward, find the strength to stand tall, and create spaces where we are seen and valued. Whether that's through true friends, kind neighbors, or simply choosing peace within our own homes, the lesson is the same. Self-worth cannot be stolen unless we allow it. As we grow older, the most powerful act is not clinging to those who dismiss us, but walking toward the life we deserve, with calm, with clarity, and with courage. If this message speaks to you, don't just watch quietly. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more stories, and let us know where you're listening from.